On the surface, Ravenwood Heights looked like the kind of neighborhood people dreamed of moving into. Wide, tree-lined streets. Stately homes set back behind wrought iron gates. Perfectly trimmed hedges, stone fountains in the yards, and children's bicycles leaning carelessly against garages. In the summer of 2016, few places in Baltimore felt safer, calmer, or more insulated from the dangers that existed just beyond its borders. That was what made what happened inside the Calder mansion so impossible for people to comprehend. Thomas Calder, the head of Calder Steelworks, was a man whose life seemed to embody success. He wasn't born into wealth. Friends often said he had earned everything he had through an almost obsessive work ethic. His company supplied custom steel materials to projects across the eastern seaboard. Stadiums, office towers, even government buildings bore his mark. If there was one word people used for him, it was driven. But he was also, by all accounts, deeply human. A man who never forgot a birthday at the office, who stayed late to talk to employees when they were struggling, who volunteered his time coaching youth baseball leagues when his own children were younger. His wife, Rebecca, balanced him in every way. Where Thomas was precise and focused, Rebecca was warm and creative. A part-time art teacher, she seemed to carry the rhythms of the classroom into her daily life. Always patient, always ready to lend a hand, and always quick with a smile. They had 3 children. Lydia, 18, and Clara, 15, were both away at boarding school in Pennsylvania, something that still stirred gossip among neighbors who didn't see why such wealthy parents would send their daughters away. But for the Calders, it was about giving their girls the best education possible. Their youngest, Michael, just 10, was at home. Bright-eyed, obsessed with go-karts and speed, the boy's laugh could carry across the yard in the afternoons. To outsiders, the Calders were everything a family should be. But in early June 2016, something would move quietly, almost invisibly, into their perfect world. And in the span of less than 24 hours, the Calder family home would become the scene of one of the most disturbing crimes the city had ever seen. The morning of June 7th began like any other. Michael had stayed home from school. He had taken a spill at the go-kart track a few days earlier and was still complaining of headaches. Rebecca fussed over him, bringing tea and crackers, insisting he lie down. Thomas, meanwhile, left the house early, heading toward Virginia to check on one of his latest projects. A martial arts training center he was proud to be opening in just a matter of days. With him that morning was Marisol Fuentes, the Calders' longtime housekeeper. Marisol had worked for the family for over 20 years, and in many ways she was part of them. She had seen the children grow, had been there through birthdays, holidays, and family milestones. Her own family lived in Honduras, where she sent money faithfully every month. She had spoken often about retiring soon, finally going back home to spend her last years with her husband. Neighbors saw Thomas's black SUV leave around 9 a.m., Marisol in the passenger seat. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing gave away that anything was wrong. Throughout the day, things appeared routine. A dog-sitting service called to confirm a scheduled appointment. Rebecca answered, but the employee later remarked her voice sounded strange, tired, distant, as if something was weighing on her. Around 5 p.m., Thomas phoned Rebecca, though no one knew exactly what was said. He then told Marisol he was heading home to spend time with Michael, as Rebecca had plans to meet friends. But Rebecca never left the house. Instead, by evening she was inside with Marisol. Calls to her went unanswered, text messages unreturned. Marisol's husband grew anxious when she didn't come home by mid-afternoon, something completely out of character. At 9 p.m., Rebecca placed a small order with Domino's Pizza, 2 pepperoni pizzas, paid with her credit card. She asked the delivery driver to leave the food on the doorstep and not ring the bell, explaining she was caring for a sick child. When the driver arrived, he did as instructed. He noticed a tip envelope by the mat, the porch light glowing, but the rest of the house was dark and silent. He didn't think much of it. He placed the food down, got back into his car, and drove away. Inside the Calder home, something terrible was already underway. Later that night at 9:35, Thomas left a voicemail for Marisol. His voice, usually calm and steady, carried an odd, tense edge. He told her not to come in to work the next morning. He claimed Rebecca wasn't feeling well, that Marisol would stay the night. He asked her to confirm she got the message. It was strange. Marisol had never stayed overnight at the Calder house in her 20 years of employment. The explanation didn't make sense. But no one knew what else was happening. By the next morning, June 8th, neighbors walking their dogs noticed both of the Calder family cars still parked in the driveway. That was odd. Thomas usually left early. Rebecca was active in the community, often seen running errands or gardening by mid-morning. Now the house was still. At around 10 a.m., another message went out from Thomas's phone, this time to his assistant and personal driver, Jason Myers. Jason had only been with the family a short time, but Thomas trusted him enough to ask for something unusual. He wanted Jason to retrieve $50,000 in cash from the company account and deliver it to the house. His instructions were clear: place the money inside the red sports car parked in the garage, and do not knock on the door. Jason did exactly that. At 10:26 a.m. he texted back, "Package delivered." He waited for a reply. The message thread showed typing bubbles appear, then disappear. But no response ever came. Hours later, smoke would rise from the Calder mansion. No one could know it yet, but what was unfolding inside the house was a carefully staged nightmare. For nearly 19 hours, the Calders and Marisol had been held captive by someone who knew exactly how to exploit fear, silence, and time. The ransom was only part of it. What the intruder truly intended would soon become clear, and the brutality of it would leave even hardened detectives shaken. To understand the tragedy that unfolded inside Ravenwood Heights, you have to know the family who lived there. Because the story of the Calder murders is not just about the nightmarish hours of captivity. It is about who they were before the terror, and why their loss cut so deep into the community around them. Thomas Calder's life had always seemed larger than life to those who knew him. He grew up in Baltimore, the son of a steelworker who spent 30 years in a hot, noisy factory. As a boy, Thomas spent his afternoons waiting for his father to come home, boots scuffed with black dust, hands blistered from lifting raw metal. Thomas would watch him collapse into the kitchen chair, exhausted but proud. That image stayed with him. He once told a friend that his father's strength taught him two things: never fear hard work and never forget the dignity of people who build the world with their hands. By his mid-30s, Thomas had taken those lessons and turned them into Calder Steelworks, a company that specialized in custom fabrication for some of the biggest building projects on the East Coast. Business partners described him as relentless in negotiations but fair to the men on the floor. He didn't just run a company, he cultivated loyalty. At company picnics, workers' children would climb on his back while he grilled hamburgers, and he knew every employee's name. But at home he was simply Dad. He drove his son Michael to go-kart tracks every Saturday, cheered from the sidelines, and made promises about building a small practice course in the backyard someday. For his daughters Lydia and Clara, he was the kind of father who proofread their essays late at night and slipped folded bills into their pockets when they returned to boarding school. His wife, Rebecca, had been his balance from the very beginning. They met in college, he, the focused law student with ambition, she, the art major who believed in color, texture, and slowing down long enough to notice beauty. Friends joked they were opposites, but it was their opposites that made them whole. Where he planned meticulously, she reminded him to be present. Where he grew sharp under pressure, she softened the edges. Rebecca worked part-time as an art teacher at a local community center. She decorated the Calder home with her own canvases, soft landscapes, portraits of her children, still life paintings of fruit and flowers. She organized neighborhood charity auctions, sometimes giving her paintings away to raise funds. Parents at Michael's school remembered her gingerbread houses at Christmas, elaborate creations that looked like something out of a storybook. Neighbors in Ravenwood Heights described the Calders as approachable despite their wealth. Rebecca was the kind of woman who would stop to chat at the mailbox, who lent sugar and flour to the young couple across the street, who brought soup when someone was sick. Thomas, though busier, was known for sponsoring community projects: the refurbishment of a local park, scholarships for children of his employees, donations to the National Child Research Center. Michael, their youngest, was the heartbeat of the house. 10 years old, full of energy, he adored speed. His obsession with go-karts came from his father, who once surprised him with a weekend trip to Daytona to watch professional racing. Michael wore that trip like a badge of honor, telling everyone at school about the roar of engines, and how someday he would race cars himself. He was small for his age but unusually mature. His go-kart coach once said, "He's 10 going on 35. The Calder daughters, Lydia and Clara, were less visible to neighbors because of boarding school, but their presence was still felt. Lydia, preparing for college, carried her mother's warmth and her father's determination. Clara, just 15, had inherited Rebecca's creativity, filling sketchbooks with designs and photographs whenever she came home on break. Friends recalled how close the sisters were, always walking together, whispering in corners, sharing inside jokes. And then there was Marisol. Though not a Calder by blood, Marisol Fuentes had become family. Born in Honduras, she came to the United States in her early 30s, searching for better opportunities for her children. For 20 years she worked in the Calder household, becoming a constant presence through every milestone. Birthdays, graduations, family vacations. Marisol was there. She was more than a housekeeper. She was a confidant, a second mother to the Calder children, and a trusted hand to Rebecca. Every paycheck she earned was carefully split, part for her modest life in Baltimore, the rest wired back home to her husband and children studying in Central America. By 2016, Marisol often spoke about retiring. She dreamed of returning to Honduras, sitting on the porch of her family's small home, hearing the sound of the ocean in the distance. She had counted the years and told friends she would stop working after one more. Next year, she said. Just one more year. All of these threads, the ambitious father, the gentle mother, the joyful boy, the loyal housekeeper, wove together into a tapestry of a family admired and respected. They were, in every sense, the perfect neighbors. People waved when they passed. Children knocked on their door every Halloween. Their home on Ravenwood Drive, a sprawling brick mansion with tall windows and a manicured lawn, became a kind of landmark in the neighborhood. That is why, when tragedy struck, the shock cut so deeply. Because the Calder family was not faceless. They were not anonymous. They were woven into the lives of dozens of people around them. Their kindness, their presence, and their daily routines made the horror of what followed all the more unbearable. As detectives later said, you couldn't understand the crime until you understood the victims. The violence wasn't just against individuals. It was against everything they represented: family, generosity, and the illusion of safety in a wealthy, quiet suburb. In the days after their deaths, friends and neighbors described their grief in the same way: disbelief. Disbelief that someone could hurt them. Disbelief that such horror could live alongside such goodness. Disbelief that a family so deeply embedded in their community could be torn out in one violent sweep. But disbelief didn't erase what had happened. And what had happened began quietly. A strange tone in Rebecca's voice. A pizza box left at the door. A message that Marisol didn't need to come in. These were the warning signs. And yet, no one saw them for what they were. Not until it was too late. June 7, 2016, began like so many other summer days in Ravenwood Heights. The lawns glistened with morning dew, gardeners clipped hedges along driveways, and joggers traced their usual routes past brick mansions. To anyone passing by the Calder residence that morning, it looked no different from any other day. Inside, however, small shifts had already begun. Michael Calder stayed home from school, his head still sore from the minor accident at the go-kart track. His mother, Rebecca, decided not to leave him alone. She canceled an afternoon coffee with friends and spent the morning fussing over her boy, setting him up on the living room couch with cartoons and soup. Michael didn't complain. He enjoyed the attention and the extra time with his mother. Thomas Calder, meanwhile, left early. He had been pouring energy into a new business venture, a martial arts training academy set to open in Virginia. The grand opening was only days away, and he wanted to ensure everything was perfect. With him that day was Marisol Fuentes, the housekeeper, who tagged along to tidy and help prepare the facility. Witnesses later recalled seeing Thomas's SUV parked outside the nearly finished building, Thomas giving orders to contractors while Marisol swept floors and wiped down counters. Everything seemed ordinary. By mid-afternoon, Thomas wrapped up and told Marisol he needed to return home. He mentioned that Rebecca had plans that evening and he wanted to spend time with Michael. To Marisol it sounded routine. She expected she would be home in her own kitchen by dinner time, cooking for her husband. But by late afternoon, small irregularities began to ripple through the Calder household. At 4:25 p.m., a dog-sitting service phoned the house to confirm a scheduled appointment. An employee who spoke with Rebecca later described her voice as strangely subdued. Normally cheerful and chatty, she sounded tired, distracted, like someone who had been awake too long. The employee remembered thinking Rebecca was sick. She wasn't. At 5 p.m., Thomas phoned Rebecca. No one knows exactly what was said, but neighbors noticed that shortly afterward, Thomas seemed anxious to leave his office. By 5:30, he had returned to Ravenwood Drive. Around the same time, Marisol's husband, Ernesto, grew worried. Marisol usually finished work at 3 in the afternoon and was always home on time. She had never once failed to call if she was running late. By 5, she was unreachable. Calls to her phone rang and then cut off. He tried again and again, but each attempt ended the same way. He assumed the battery had died. But unease gnawed at him. That evening things took a darker turn. At 9 p.m., Rebecca phoned Domino's Pizza, placing a simple order: 2 pepperoni pizzas. She used her credit card and instructed the delivery driver to leave the food on the doorstep. "Don't ring the bell," she said. "My son isn't feeling well." Just leave it by the front door. At 9:15, the delivery driver pulled into Ravenwood Drive. The Calder mansion loomed ahead, its porch light glowing warmly. He followed instructions. He placed the boxes neatly on the doormat, noticed a small envelope marked tip, and slid it under the pizza. He found it odd that the house was so dark beyond the porch, but he assumed everyone was asleep. He turned, walked back to his car and continued his route. He had no idea what was happening inside. At 9:35, Thomas left a voicemail for Marisol. His voice was low, uneasy. "Hi, it's Thomas. Don't come in tomorrow. Rebecca's not feeling well and Marisol is staying the night here. Please text me to confirm you got this." For someone who had known the Calder family as long as Marisol had, the message would later strike as chilling. In 2 decades she had never once stayed overnight at the Calder mansion. There was no reason for her to. The explanation didn't add up. The voicemail wouldn't be heard until the next morning. By then it was far too late. At 10 a.m. the following day, Thomas made another unusual call, this time to his personal driver, Jason Myers. Thomas instructed Jason to withdraw $50,000 in cash from the company and bring it to the house. His words were precise, almost scripted. Jason was told not to knock, not to ring the bell, but to place the money in the family's red sports car parked in the garage. Jason followed the instructions exactly. At 10:26 a.m. he sent a text, "Package delivered." He lingered in his car afterward, watching his phone. The message thread showed 3 dots appearing as if Thomas was typing. Then they disappeared. Nothing else came. For Jason it was a minor puzzle. For investigators, it was the last communication from Thomas Calder before everything collapsed. By early afternoon, Ravenwood Drive grew uneasy. Neighbors noticed that both Calder vehicles were still parked in the driveway. On a weekday morning this was unusual. Thomas was always out by 8. Rebecca rarely stayed indoors for long. But the house was locked, blinds drawn, silent. At 1:15 p.m. the silence broke. A column of smoke rose above the Calder mansion. Neighbors dialed 911. Within minutes, fire engines screamed down Ravenwood Drive, sirens slicing through the quiet neighborhood. Flames licked from the second-story windows as firefighters stormed inside. They expected to find an electrical fire or perhaps an accident in the kitchen. What they found instead made seasoned professionals stagger. The house was not just burning. It had been turned into a crime scene. In less than 19 hours, a family admired and beloved by their community had been trapped, terrorized, and extinguished in one of the most deliberate, calculated home invasions the city had ever seen. The fatal day had begun with sunlight and normal routines. Michael watching cartoons, Rebecca baking, Thomas checking on a new business venture. By the following afternoon, it ended in fire, ashes, and death. And yet, as investigators would soon discover, the fire was not the cause of their deaths. It was meant to erase something much worse. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came not from inside the Calder mansion, but from the outside world trying to reach it. On the evening of June 7, while the Domino's driver was leaving 2 pizzas at the doorstep, Marisol's husband, Ernesto, was pacing their kitchen. It was already after 9 o'clock and she had never called. 20 years of routine told him this wasn't right. Marisol finished by 3 every afternoon. By 5 she was home. By 6 they ate dinner together. By 7 she was phoning their children overseas. That night, silence. He dialed again and again. The calls rang and then went dead as though her phone had been switched off or the battery had drained. Ernesto told himself not to panic. Maybe she had chosen to stay late and clean. Maybe she left the phone in her bag. But as the hours passed, the pit in his stomach only grew deeper. What Ernesto didn't know was that at nearly the same time, Thomas Calder was leaving that strange voicemail, telling Marisol not to come to work the next morning. His voice carried an edge, a clipped tone that friends later said was completely unlike him. The message was polite, even calm on the surface, but something about the way he paused, as if someone was watching him while he spoke. By morning the signals turned darker. At 9 a.m. on June 8, a text arrived for Nellie, the Calder's part-time cleaning lady who often rotated shifts with Marisol. It came from Rebecca's phone. The message echoed Thomas's voicemail. Nellie didn't need to come in that day. It sounded casual enough, but Nellie had been with the Calders for so long that she immediately felt something was off. In 20 years, neither Thomas nor Rebecca had ever abruptly canceled without notice. More unsettling was the phrasing. Rebecca always texted warmly with exclamation points and small touches of personality. This message was short, flat, almost mechanical. When Nellie later played the voicemail from Thomas, she swore she heard more in the background, faint sounds that chilled her. A muffled noise like someone was moving furniture. She even thought she heard a scream, but it was distant, cut off quickly as though someone had covered a mouth. She called back. No answer. She texted. No reply. That same morning, Jason Myers, the assistant and personal driver, was at Calder Steelworks headquarters. He was a young man still proving himself, thrilled to have been hired by someone as prominent as Thomas Calder. At 9:45 a.m. his phone buzzed. It was Thomas. The request he heard stunned him. Thomas instructed Jason to visit the company's bank, withdraw $50,000 in cash, and bring it directly to the Ravenwood mansion. The instructions were precise, unusually so. Jason was told not to ring the bell, not to knock, not even to alert anyone inside. He was to take the money in a package and place it inside the red Porsche parked in the Calder garage. Jason hesitated. He had never been asked to do something like this before. $50,000 was no small sum, and Thomas spoke as though reading from a script. Jason later told investigators that his boss sounded tense, hurried, and strangely detached. But Thomas was his employer and Jason was eager to please. He did as instructed. By 10:20 a.m., Jason parked outside the Ravenwood mansion. The driveway looked as it always did, pristine with trimmed hedges and the Porsche gleaming in the morning light. Both family SUVs were still in place, which struck him as odd. Usually by this hour at least one car was gone. Jason stepped inside the garage, lifted the Porsche's trunk, and slid the package inside. Then he retreated quickly to his own vehicle. As he sat in the driver's seat, he typed a text, "Package delivered." 3 dots appeared on his screen, the universal sign that someone on the other end was typing a reply. He waited. The dots vanished. No answer came. Around the same time, Ernesto drove to the mansion himself, desperate to find his wife. He rang the bell, knocked on the door, pressed his ear against the frame. At first, silence. Then faint noises. Dogs barking inside. Something scraping across the floor, like a chair being dragged. He called out. No one answered. Then his phone buzzed. It was Thomas Calder. The call was brief, strangely apologetic. Thomas repeated what he had said in the voicemail, that Rebecca was sick, that Marisol had stayed overnight, that Ernesto shouldn't worry. His words were calm but hollow, almost rehearsed. Ernesto wanted to believe him. But why wouldn't Thomas simply open the door? He was right there. Ernesto hung up, unconvinced, but forced himself to leave. He drove home, still waiting for a call from Marisol that would never come. By late morning, Ravenwood Heights felt uneasy. Neighbors noted the Calder's vehicles still hadn't moved. No one had been seen leaving the house. Curtains remained drawn. For such a lively family it was unusual. Yet no one raised an alarm. Wealthy families guarded privacy. People didn't pry. But behind those drawn curtains, the family was living through hours of unthinkable fear. It is believed that by this point all 4, Thomas, Rebecca, Michael, and Marisol, were bound and gagged. They had been held captive since the previous evening. The order for pizza, the abrupt messages to employees, even the ransom demand were not their own decisions. They were orchestrated by someone else. Someone who knew the Calder routines. Someone who had no intention of leaving witnesses alive. The $50,000 was never about money. It was about control. By noon, Jason still hadn't heard back from Thomas. He assumed the matter was resolved and drove away. He would later tell investigators that as he left Ravenwood Drive, he felt a chill, as if someone was watching from behind the mansion's tall windows. At 1:30 p.m., smoke began to rise. What had started with a pizza order and a strange message was now barreling toward an ending no one could have imagined. And when firefighters finally broke through the doors of the Calder mansion, they would discover the truth, that the ransom was only the beginning, and the silence that gripped the house was far more sinister than anyone realized. By the early afternoon of June 8, the stillness of Ravenwood Drive had shifted from curious to unsettling. The Calder family cars remained in the driveway. Curtains were drawn. The mansion, usually alive with movement, stood silent and closed off. Some neighbors brushed it aside. Wealthy families valued privacy. But others felt uneasy. One woman, walking her dog, noticed the faint smell of gasoline in the air. She thought little of it at the time. At 1:27 p.m., the first wisps of smoke began curling out of the second-floor windows of the Calder mansion. Within minutes, the smoke thickened, black against the blue sky. Calls to 911 flooded in from Ravenwood Heights. Fire engines roared down the tree-lined streets, sirens slicing through the calm suburban afternoon. When firefighters arrived, they were struck by how quickly the fire had spread. Flames licked out of upstairs windows. Heat poured through the front doorway. Dogs barked wildly in the yard, having been let out or forced out before the fire consumed the interior. Their frantic movements signaled what no one wanted to believe: there were people still inside. The first team forced the door open. Smoke billowed out, choking and acrid. Visibility inside was almost zero. They swept the first floor, searching for signs of life. The kitchen was intact. A box of untouched pizza sat on the counter, only half-eaten as though abandoned mid-meal. Firefighters pushed deeper. Upstairs, the fire raged strongest. One crew breached a bedroom door. Inside, the scene stopped even veteran responders in their tracks. 3 bodies lay together: Thomas, Rebecca, and Marisol. Their wrists bore the remnants of duct tape. Nearby, a broken baseball bat lay scorched, half-charred by flames. The 3 had been bound, beaten, and left to burn. In the adjacent room, firefighters made another discovery. On a bed, nearly consumed by fire, lay the body of 10-year-old Michael. His small frame was burned so badly that, in those first moments, responders couldn't even determine his gender. Later examinations revealed stab wounds and evidence of a sword-like weapon. Investigators would conclude Michael may have been alive when the fire began. It was a sight so brutal that hardened men, used to car wrecks and infernos, would later admit it haunted them. The fire was brought under control within 40 minutes, but the house was destroyed. Charred beams jutted out like broken bones. Windows were blackened hollows. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and security, now stood as a husk of ash and silence. As smoke cleared, detectives began their work. They found signs that chilled them further. Remnants of gasoline had been poured across the upstairs carpets. A knife was found wedged into a window frame, as if used to prop it open. Shoe prints, too small to belong to any firefighter, were embedded in soot near a back door. One window showed signs of forced entry, though carefully concealed. Most unsettling was what was missing. The home's security system, which had cameras throughout the mansion, no longer functioned. In the garage, investigators found the cables and keyboard of the recording unit, but the hard drive itself was gone. Someone had taken it. And so, while the fire looked like an accident to the untrained eye, detectives immediately knew this was no accident. This was arson staged to erase the evidence of something far worse. Outside, neighbors gathered behind police tape, watching the smoke rise. News crews soon arrived, microphones and cameras pointed at shaken residents. Everyone spoke of disbelief. "The Calders were so kind," one neighbor said, tears streaking her face. "Rebecca made cookies for all the kids. Michael was just here last weekend, showing off his go-kart helmet. How could this happen?" In the chaos, firefighters carried out the family dogs, trembling but alive. They placed them into animal control vans. For a moment, neighbors thought perhaps the family too had survived. But as stretchers emerged, covered in sheets, the truth settled in like a heavy stone. For people were dead. The medical examiner's initial findings were grim. All 4 victims bore signs of prolonged captivity. Bruises, restraints, cuts and blunt force trauma. Thomas and Rebecca had been beaten severely before death. Marisol's injuries were similar. She had been a target, not just collateral. Michael's case was worst of all. In addition to burns, he had stab wounds and injuries consistent with suffocation. Some evidence suggested he was doused in accelerant, his room the ignition point for the fire. Detectives couldn't confirm whether he was already dead before the flames consumed him. The ambiguity itself was horrifying. Zip ties were found melted into the carpet. Duct tape, partially burned, clung to wrists. The family had been restrained for hours before their deaths. Investigators began piecing together the timeline. The pizza order. The ransom demand. The delivery of cash. The fire. It painted a picture of nearly 19 hours of terror. The Calder mansion, once pristine, was now cordoned off by yellow tape. Detectives scoured every corner for clues. They noted the untouched valuables. Expensive art still hanging on the walls, jewelry still in drawers, cash still in safes. Whoever did this hadn't come for theft. But then came the breakthrough. In the kitchen, among the soot and half-burned debris, lay a Domino's pizza box. Inside, one slice was missing. Another had been partially eaten and left behind. Forensic teams carefully bagged the crusts, preserving them for DNA testing. The killer, in his arrogance or hunger, had left a piece of himself behind. By dusk, news outlets across Baltimore and the nation carried the story. Wealthy family slain in mansion fire. The words didn't capture the horror, the cruelty, or the senselessness of what had taken place. Behind the headlines, detectives pushed forward. They had 4 bodies, a burned home, and the faint outlines of a carefully staged crime. But what they didn't yet have was a suspect. That would change soon. Because buried in that pizza box was the genetic fingerprint of a man who thought he had erased every trace of himself. When the flames at the Ravenwood mansion finally died down, the air carried the acrid stench of smoke and gasoline. The blackened frame of the Calder home stood like a skeleton against the pale sky, windows shattered, roof collapsed. Firefighters emerged exhausted, their uniforms streaked with soot. Behind them, detectives crossed the police tape, ready to begin work on what was no longer a fire scene, but a quadruple homicide. At first, the scale of the destruction made it difficult to know where to start. The second floor was gutted. Charred furniture collapsed into piles of ash. In the bedroom where Thomas, Rebecca, and Marisol were found, the fire had eaten through the walls, leaving only the warped springs of a mattress and the skeletal remains of a baseball bat. In the adjacent room where Michael lay, the flames had burned hottest. His bed frame was twisted metal, the sheets reduced to blackened scraps. Yet, even amid devastation, evidence survived. The bodies told a story. Melted plastic zip ties fused to the carpet. Duct tape clung to Rebecca's wrists. Bruises across Thomas's arms and Marisol's torso showed they had fought, or at least tried to. The autopsies confirmed it. Each victim had endured blunt force trauma, strangulation, and stabbing before the fire began. To detectives, the fire was clearly staged. The accelerant had been poured deliberately across the upstairs hallways. The point of ignition had been Michael's room, as though someone wanted to ensure the boy's body was destroyed first. But what disturbed investigators most was what wasn't missing. Jewelry remained in drawers. Paintings still hung on the walls. A safe in the study held stacks of untouched cash. This wasn't burglary. Whoever did this hadn't come for valuables. They had come for something else. Then came another discovery. In the garage where Jason Myers had placed the package of cash, detectives noticed something odd. The family's extensive home surveillance system had been dismantled. Wires lay coiled on the floor. The keyboard was there. Even the monitor. But the recording unit, the hard drive that stored every camera angle inside and outside the mansion, was gone. Whoever set the fire had known about the cameras. They had taken the only piece that could have shown exactly what happened in those 19 hours. This pointed to knowledge. Intimacy. The killer wasn't a stranger stumbling into a wealthy home at random. This was someone who knew the Calders. Someone who had been inside before. But in the kitchen, investigators found the single clue that would break the case wide open. On the counter, amid soot and ash, sat a Domino's pizza box. One slice was missing. Another had been partially eaten and left behind. The crust bore clear impressions of teeth. At first glance, it looked like a trivial detail. But experienced homicide detectives knew better. Criminals can burn houses, steal cameras, and destroy records. But the smallest oversight, the tiniest fragment, can speak louder than anything else. Forensic teams bagged the crusts carefully, sealing them for DNA analysis. It would take only days for the results to return. The lab's conclusion shocked no one more than the detectives themselves. DNA recovered from the pizza crust belonged to a man already known to law enforcement. Derrick Wade, 34 years old. Wade wasn't a stranger. Years earlier, he had worked briefly for Calder Steelworks, Thomas's company. Employees remembered him as volatile, quick to anger, and prone to carrying grudges. His time at the company ended after he threatened a coworker with a knife. Since then, Wade's life had spiraled into arrests. Assault, burglary, destruction of property, weapons charges. To police, the DNA hit was like a fingerprint pressed against glass. It placed Wade inside the Calder mansion during the exact window of the crime. But the question remained, could one man have done all this alone? Detectives soon pieced together Wade's movements. A blue Porsche belonging to the Calders had been seen leaving Ravenwood Drive shortly after the fire began. Hours later, it was discovered abandoned and set ablaze in the parking lot of a church in nearby Maryland. Surveillance footage captured a man in dark clothing fleeing the scene, carrying what appeared to be a white box. Inside the burned Porsche, investigators recovered a construction vest, charred but intact enough for DNA testing. The results once again pointed back to Wade. It was as if he couldn't help leaving his trail behind. By May 20th, less than a week after the murders, an arrest warrant was issued for Derrick Wade. The media splashed his face across every news outlet. Armed and dangerous. Those words accompanied his photo. But Wade was already on the move. He fled Washington, D.C., slipping north toward New York. U.S. Marshals tracked him across state lines, tailing him through bus stations and cheap motels. Witnesses reported seeing him with bundles of cash, nervously scanning crowds. At one point he even texted his girlfriend photos of 2 iPhones, asking if they could be traced. He had gone from calculated predator to desperate fugitive. Digging deeper, detectives uncovered Wade's past with the Calders. He had occasionally been seen at their mansion years earlier, working on maintenance jobs. He knew the layout. He knew the routines. More importantly, he carried resentment. He had begged for his job back after being fired but was turned away. To some, he was a man who felt cheated, humiliated, left behind while Thomas Calder built an empire. The pieces aligned too neatly. His DNA on the pizza, his vest in the Porsche, his history with the family, his violent past. Yet whispers of doubt crept in. Witnesses had seen 2 different men near the Calder property on the day of the murders. One with dreadlocks like Wade and another with short hair and a neon vest. Could Wade have had help? Was he the mastermind or simply one piece of a larger plan? Police didn't have answers. But what they had was enough to pursue. On May 21st, U.S. Marshals cornered Wade at a motel in College Park, Maryland. He was arrested without incident, though investigators noted he seemed strangely calm, even detached, as if he didn't fully grasp the magnitude of what he had done, or perhaps was preparing to deny it altogether. In his possession, authorities found stacks of $100 bills, his pockets lined with cash taken during the ransom drop. The man whose hunger had betrayed him, the man who had lingered just long enough to eat a slice of pizza in the middle of 19 hours of cruelty, was now in custody. But even as the news broke, relief was tempered by unease. Because while the DNA was indisputable, the scale of the crime left everyone asking, could Derrick Wade have really done this alone? The arrest of Derrick Wade brought a wave of relief to Baltimore, but relief quickly turned into questions. To the public, the evidence seemed overwhelming. His DNA on the pizza crust, his vest found in the burned Porsche, his history with the Calders. Yet those who had followed the case closely wondered if it was truly that simple. Could one man have held 4 people hostage for 19 hours, forced a ransom and then staged a fire alone? Or was Wade only part of a larger, darker story? In the weeks after his arrest, Wade denied everything. In his first court appearance, he stood silent, eyes downcast, shackled at the wrists. His defense attorney claimed he had been framed, insisting that Wade was nothing more than a scapegoat. The words carried little weight against the evidence. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. The prosecution laid out a case that was methodical, piece by piece. They showed jurors photographs of the burned mansion, the charred remains of the victims, and the pizza box that survived the flames. They explained how DNA linked Wade not only to the pizza but also to the construction vest inside the Porsche. They presented testimony from Calder Steelworks employees who remembered Wade's violent temper, his threats, and his termination years earlier. The motive, they said, was greed laced with resentment. Yet the defense pushed back hard. They claimed the DNA was unreliable, that Wade hated pizza, and would never have eaten it. They argued that the crime was too complex, too organized for Wade alone. They pointed to Jason Myers, the personal assistant who had delivered the ransom money. Why did Jason's story change in small but important details? Why did he take a photograph of the cash and send it to a friend only to delete it later? Why was he carrying documents belonging to Thomas Calder in his backpack? The defense also hinted at Wade's brothers, men with their own criminal pasts, suggesting they had been involved. Perhaps they argued Wade had been there but not as the killer, only as a bystander drawn into something larger. The courtroom became a stage where every detail of those 19 hours was examined, dissected, and replayed. Jurors listened to recordings of Thomas's voicemail, his tense voice telling Marisol not to come in. They heard about Rebecca's unusual text to the other maid, its cold tone so unlike her usual warmth. They saw the surveillance stills of the Porsche driving away from Ravenwood Drive, and the footage of a man fleeing the burned car in Maryland. Each piece of evidence circled back to Wade, but the defense worked tirelessly to muddy the water. Family members of the victims filled the benches every day. Lydia and Clara, the surviving daughters, sat together, their faces pale, their hands clasped. Reporters described them as silent pillars, listening as strangers debated the fate of their parents and brother. When the autopsy details were read aloud, Lydia wept quietly, her younger sister holding her hand. The prosecution reminded the jury that motive was not everything. Evidence was. And the evidence, they said, spoke louder than Wade's denials. His DNA was at the heart of it. No amount of theorizing about conspiracies or accomplices could explain why his saliva was on the pizza eaten in the Calder kitchen during the time of the murders. Wade himself took the stand in his own defense, against his lawyer's advice. He admitted to being at the mansion but insisted he had been tricked by others, claiming he left when he realized something terrible was happening. He said his brothers had planned to rob the Calders and that Jason Myers had been part of it. He swore he had only stayed long enough to eat pizza. His words rang hollow, almost absurd given the horror of the crime. Prosecutors seized on his testimony, telling the jury that Wade's own arrogance had betrayed him. After 7 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for less than 2 days. On a cold November afternoon in 2018, the verdict was read aloud. Derrick Wade was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, extortion, burglary, arson, and theft. He showed no emotion as the words were spoken. He stood motionless, jaw set, staring straight ahead. The families of the victims wept. Lydia buried her face in Clara's shoulder. Ernesto, Marisol's husband, clutched a handkerchief, eyes closed. The sentence was swift. Wade received 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The judge's voice was firm as she told him he would never walk free again. "The crimes you committed were unspeakable," she said. "You had what you wanted. You could have left. Instead you chose cruelty. You chose death." Outside the courthouse, prosecutors praised the verdict, though they acknowledged the lingering questions. "We may never know if others were involved," one said. "But what we do know is that Derrick Wade played a central role in these murders, and today justice has been served." For the Calder daughters, justice was only a word. They had lost their parents, their brother, and the home they grew up in. No sentence could restore that. At the funeral, Lydia wrote to her father, "You will always be my hero. Because of you, I know how to be brave." To her mother, "Thank you for being the best mom I could have asked for." To her brother, "I would do anything to see that smile again." For Ernesto, closure never came. Marisol's body was flown back to Honduras, where her children buried her beneath the soil of the home she had dreamed of returning to. The money she sent faithfully for years was gone, and so was the future she had hoped for them. And for the neighborhood of Ravenwood Heights, the memory of smoke rising from the Calder mansion lingered long after the house was demolished and rebuilt. Wealth, gates, and manicured lawns had not protected the family inside. Evil had slipped through anyway. In the end, the trial gave answers but not certainty. Wade was guilty beyond doubt. Yet the haunting question remained, whispered in every corner of Baltimore: did he really do it alone? The Calder case did not end with the conviction of Derrick Wade. In many ways, that was only the beginning of a longer shadow that stretched over Baltimore and beyond. Justice, at least in a legal sense, had been delivered. But justice did not rebuild homes, mend broken families, or quiet the questions that refused to go away. For Lydia and Clara Calder, life after the trial was a strange kind of exile. The mansion where they had grown up had been demolished. The smoldering ruins had been cleared, and a new house was eventually built on the property, but they could not return. The address carried too much pain. The sisters moved into a modest apartment downtown, far from the manicured lawns of Ravenwood Heights. They clung to each other, bound by trauma and loss, their bond now the only piece of family that remained. They avoided publicity as much as they could, though reporters often tried to find them. Sometimes Lydia spoke quietly at victim advocacy events. She told audiences that grief was not something you escaped, it was something you learned to live with. Clara almost never spoke in public. She preferred silence, though those close to her said her silence carried more weight than words. The Calder Steelworks Company, once a proud local institution, suffered a different kind of wound. With Thomas Calder gone, leadership fell into confusion. Investors withdrew, contracts faltered, and within 2 years the company filed for bankruptcy. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs. For Baltimore's working-class neighborhoods, the closure was more than an economic blow, it was the end of a century-old legacy. Old-timers still shake their heads when they pass the abandoned factory, saying the Calders had built something lasting, only for greed and violence to tear it apart. Marisol Ortega's story echoed far beyond Baltimore. Her body had been returned to Honduras, where her husband and children buried her in a quiet village cemetery. To them she had been more than a maid, she had been the family's hope. 4 years she had sent home every spare dollar, building a dream brick by brick. After her death, donations from Baltimore's immigrant community helped the children stay in school. But Ernesto, her husband, never fully recovered. He stopped speaking of plans, and those who knew him said he seemed older overnight, as if time had claimed him too soon. For investigators, the case left behind uneasy questions. Officially, Wade was the killer. His DNA was the linchpin, his conviction the legal closure. But behind closed doors, detectives admitted they were never fully satisfied. The complexity of the 19-hour ordeal suggested multiple hands. Jason Myers, the assistant who delivered the ransom, remained a figure of suspicion. He had cooperated with investigators, but his behavior, those deleted texts, the inconsistencies, was never fully explained. Wade's brothers were interviewed, but no charges stuck. Some detectives privately believed accomplices walked free, their names buried with the evidence that couldn't be proven. The public fascination with the case only grew. Documentaries aired, books were written, and late-night shows debated whether Wade had truly acted alone. The pizza crust, so ordinary yet so damning, became a grim symbol, how the smallest detail can unravel the darkest of crimes. But for those closest to the victims, fascination was an intrusion. Lydia once said in a rare interview, "People want answers, but they forget that for us, it's not a story. It's our life. We don't get to turn the page when the episode ends." Over time, the Calder tragedy became part of Baltimore's collective memory, like a scar the city carried. The rebuilt mansion stood silent, bought by another wealthy family who tried to erase the past. Yet neighbors still whispered whenever they passed the iron gates. At night, the glow of porch lights on Ravenwood Drive carried an unspoken warning. Even behind walls and wealth, no one is untouchable. The trial had established guilt. The aftermath revealed consequence. Families torn apart, businesses destroyed, a community shaken. The Calder name, once a mark of pride, was now synonymous with horror. And the silence of those who might have known more ensured that the story remained unfinished. Every so often a new rumor surfaces. Someone claims to have seen Wade's brother near Ravenwood that night. Others whisper about Jason Myers and the money that vanished after the ransom was paid. None of it is ever proven, but the whispers never stop. They haunt the case, a reminder that truth and justice do not always walk the same path. Years later, Lydia visited her parents' grave for the first time since the trial. She brought Clara with her, and together they placed fresh flowers in the cold earth. Lydia whispered a promise, that she and Clara would live, that they would not let grief swallow them whole. It was not closure, but it was a step forward. The Calder Mansion murders remain one of Baltimore's most haunting crimes. Not because of the brutality alone, but because of what they revealed, that even the strongest families can be undone, that even the wealthiest walls cannot keep darkness out, and that sometimes the greatest mysteries are the ones left unsolved. And so the case closed, at least on paper. Derrick Wade sat behind bars serving life without parole. The Calders lay in the ground, their voices silenced. And the city, still asking questions, carried on, never forgetting the night when wealth and power crumbled in fire and ash.